Yeah, hello and welcome to the session installing Azure Stack HCI with Admin Center. Thank you, Dave, for the kind introduction. My name is Carsten Rachfahl, and I'm one of the Microsoft Cloud and Data Center Management and Azure MVPs. I'm also a Veeam Vanguard. That's another community program there. What else do I do? I'm the organizer of the German Cloud and Data Center Conference that usually takes place in May in the beautiful city in near Frankfurt in Hanau. This year, unfortunately, we have this pandemic, can't do it. Hopefully next year we are up and running again. And I'm also the co-founder of the German HyperV community and the hybrid cloud community. And one thing I really love is doing showcasts with my fellow MVP and Vanguard and very dear friend Didier van Houyen. We do showcasts and you find them under hyper-v-amigos.net. If you want to follow my work or my community work, you find my Twitter handle HyperV Server, very convenient. And if I don't do community work, I'm the CEO of Rachfahl IT Solutions GmbH & Co. KG. It's a German-based SI, and we install and train failover clustering, Hyper-V, and a lot of Azure Stack HCI. In fact, that's our daily business. You find some more information at our blog hypervserver.de and our courses. I do Hyper-V trainings and storage-based direct trainings under powercourse.net. But let's dive directly into our topic, and that's Windows Admin Center, and especially in Windows Admin Center, the cluster creation wizard. So when Microsoft came out with the last version of Windows Admin Center in October/November 2019, they introduced the cluster creation wizard, and that is something that really helps people who don't have the deep understanding of failover clustering and especially storage spaces direct hyperconverged cluster, help them to set it up correctly. And I really love the cluster creation wizard. So we have when we start, we have now 6 scenarios. You find them here on the screen. We have, of course, the hyperconverged scenario where we can create a failover cluster, Hyper-V storage bases direct. We can also create a hyperconverged scenario with software-defined networking. That's not topic of the talk, but you can do that, and you can just install a Hyper-V cluster here, compute cluster, only Hyper-V and failover clustering, also a storage cluster with storage bases direct, and also a standard Hyper-V cluster with software-defined networking, and we have the classic failover cluster where we just install failover clustering. But we will look, of course, into the hyperconverged scenario, and without further ado, we just jump into the demo. This is a very demo heavy session. So I press escape here, and we are now in Windows Admin Center. You see here I have only the Windows Admin Center gateway machine here, and you find the cluster creation wizard under the installed solution, but it is not here yet. So for that an additional information, 1910, the version that came out at Ignite last year, where Microsoft introduced the cluster creation wizard, had in many scenarios, in many installations, problems to go through with the cluster creation wizard. I personally only got to the cluster validation, but fortunately, around a month ago, they updated 1910 with 1910.2, and now the cluster creation wizard should work. So here is, you see, I have installed 1910.2. So we go to the settings, and under settings, we have a lot of things we can configure here, but for us, important is the extension part. Windows Admin Center is a bunch of different scenarios and extensions, and we find the cluster creation preview extension here under available extensions. I click on it and I choose install, because I have to hurry a bit. I have only half an hour for this presentation. So it's now installing the extension. It's downloading it from a Microsoft server, and then it will restart Windows Admin Center. And now we have it under installed extensions. It will take a moment to show you. So there we are with the other installed extensions. And now we can went to settings, and here we have the cluster creation solution. And I will choose that. And here you have the scenarios I talked already about, and I'm pretty sure that is not all we can expect here. Remember, the cluster creation wizard is in preview. So I choose the hyper-converged cluster. That's the Azure Stack HCI scenario where we've installed failover clustering, Hyper-V, and storage spaces direct. And I click on Create. And now we have these four, let's say, parts of the cluster creation wizard, the four chapters, and every chapter has different scenarios or different screens where we go through while configuring our cluster. So here we see, before you start, there are some prerequisites. We have a network adapter on the host configured with IP on the host that we create, or the cluster that we create, the nodes that we want to create a cluster with have to have a network adapter that admin center can reach. So we have to have an IP configuration already. The hosts have to be joined to an Active Directory domain. The cluster creation wizard is not doing that, maybe in the future, but now it is not. And we have to have a user that is a member of the local administration group on the nodes. So here I have my two nodes that are data on nodes. I love those nodes. They have 8 NVM each in each node. So here you see there are domain joined here. And let's reload that. They are not in a cluster. I tested this scenario, of course. They are not in a cluster, and I have configured the IP settings, because we can do that with the cluster creation wizard, but it takes a lot of time to give every adapter an IP address, but we will see that. So let's go back to the admin center and we go to next. And first we have to give it an account that has the required rights on the systems. So I have to type my password carefully, and now I go to next. And now I can specify the different nodes, da on S2D3 and da on S2D4. It will check if the prerequisites are installed on the hosts, and we have, you see, we have a data center evaluation edition. The hosts are good. If they wouldn't, we can change that and click on refresh, but we don't have to. So now it looks for the installed features, and Windows Admin Center would install the features. So it wants to have BitLocker, data center bridging if we configure Rocky, failover clustering, of course, the deduplication feature of the file server if we want to do deduplication, Hyper-V, and the Active Directory PowerShell module. If that would be not installed, it will install it, but then it will reboot the nodes, and I'm installing in the moment on hardware, so that takes time and we don't have the time. So I took the liberty to already do that. So everything is fine with the features. We go to next, and it will now check if we had to restart the nodes. That is not necessary because all the features were already installed. So we are finished with this part of the wizard, and we now go to the next one, networking. And here we have also 4 different things. Now it's verifying the network adapters. We have 6 network adapters on both nodes. It said it looks good, okay, but if you want to check, we open this, and you see I have 2 Mellanox NICs on a dual NIC adapter with 50 gigabits each. I will choose them for SMB. I have a 2-port QLogic 25 gigabit adapter. We will choose that for our Hyper-V switch, the set switch, and we can create that with the wizard. And I have 2 1 gigabit adapters here that I choose for my management. And usually you would configure an LBFO team on the 2 1 gigabit adapters, but the cluster creation wizard can't do that for you. So we will configure one of those adapter, and that would be work we have to do afterwards. So I click on next, but here everything is fine. We see every adapter, the same adapter on every node, and we go to next. So now it wants us to select a management adapter where it can reach the system while it creates all the stuff. It's an optional step, and I will not do that. I will just jump over it. And now it wants us to edit some adapter properties. And mainly that's IP. So you see here we have some IP addresses already filled. So I choose to have 2 different subnets for SMB. I strongly would advise that, but that's not topic here. And now I have to give this, now let's see. We don't have IPs here. Let's see if we can go by with. If when we add, you see here, we have to have a VLAN ID on every adapter, and if you don't use VLANs, you can choose 0. So, and then IP addresses must be unique across all servers, and that's not true because 2 of the nodes don't have an IP address. So I do that by choosing an APIPER address. Let's just do that. 1.2. That's a 16 network, and let's do that here too. 254 1.3. It's also a 16 address network, and let's do that here. 254. Let's choose the 1 here and the 3, and let's choose the 2 here and the 2. And it's again a class B network, and let's do that here again, 2, 3, and 16. So now it says everything is fine. We will not use those IP addresses, but the wizard in the moment requires an IP address. This will be our adapters that are in the set switch. So we don't use IP there, but unfortunately the wizard needs it, and that's a topic that can be improved later. So here under advanced, we have some more settings. We can tweak the MTU size, but I don't do that usually, so we can set it to different settings. And if we do software-defined networking, there we can configure an encapsulation overhead. We need that for SDN. SDN needs some more space in the Ethernet packet. So we are golden now. We go to next, and now it will create a virtual switch, or we have the option to do 1 virtual switch, 2 virtual switches, and a 3rd option, but that is not possible in this design, so it will be not choosable. We will see. Takes a moment, and Windows Admin Center is like the Azure portal. So you configure something in the portal, and then you click create or execute, and then it will create in Azure an ARM template, and here Windows Admin Center will create a PowerShell script and execute that, and in the background, and when it's done, you will see here a successful message, like in the Azure portal. So the configuring of the IP addresses takes a bit, so I can connect to our 2 servers. That you can see them. So here we are. It still thinks it's member of the cluster. That's not true, but unfortunately can't get rid of that. I will try a reload. You see here the IP configuration. And now we went through with the adapter properties and are now in the part of create a virtual switch. And here I already told you we have 3 options for now. We can create 1 virtual switch for compute and storage together. That's the fully converged scenario where you have only 2 adapters and everything is done over the 2 adapters. So there will be created a set switch we will use the set switch obviously for our virtual machines, but then we also will create VNICs for the management OS. So for example, a management adapter and 2 SMB adapters. But we don't have to do that because we have multiple adapters in the system. So the Windows Admin Center or the cluster creation wizard recognize that and will not offer this option. Instead, we can create a virtual switch for compute only, or we can create 2 virtual switches, one for compute and one for storage here. And I have dedicated adapters for my SMB traffic, SMB direct traffic, or SMB over RDMA. So I'm not a fan of creating a storage switch on those 2 adapters, a set switch, and then create virtual SMB adapters, because I think that's more software that we don't need. So we use these adapters directly without a set switch in front of it. So we go with the second option, create one virtual switch for compute only. And now we have to specify which adapters are for the compute/set switch. So I choose the 2 QLogic adapters on both nodes. And if I don't choose it, the same adapters on both nodes, there will be a warning down there. And if I click this, the warning is gone. Then we have some more options under advanced. For example, we can specify the switch name. Here it's compute switch. We will leave that be. You can specify, for example, another switch name, but I stay with that name. And then we can choose the load balancing algorithm for the set switch. And there are 2 options, HyperV port and dynamic. And HyperV port is the recommended one. It was changed in 2016 throughout the availability of 2016. I know usually it's dynamic if you create a switch, but Microsoft recommends Hyper-V port now. Then we have other options. This switch uses embedded teaming, so it's a set switch. SIOV is configured, and we have VMMQ enabled. So don't turn this off unless you have really problems with VMMQ, and we are not in the area of 2012 R2 anymore. There was a lot of trouble with VMMQ, but these days are over, and I always tell my students in my courses, if you turn off VMQ in your host, it's like owning a Ferrari with a stick, and you are only allowed to drive in the first gear. Imagine you are on the German highway, you can drive 250 or more, and you are only allowed to use the first gear. And so a little Polo, a German Polo is coming from behind, and you have to make place with your Ferrari. You have to turn over to the right and let the Polo overtake you. And this is like if you turn off VMQs, you don't have network power in your switch. So don't do that. And there's a nice webinar I've done with Dan Kohumo from Microsoft, and he explains in this webinar why VMMQ is very important for the switch. So let's go on with the creation of the switch. It takes a while, so I could tell the story here while we wait, but unfortunately I didn't. So we wait a moment, and we can now go to the host, and here it can open the HyperV Manager. And I will also open the failover cluster manager because we don't have a cluster yet. Server manager is wrong. If we would have a cluster, I can connect to cluster. Yeah, it says da on cluster 2, but it will not find it. So we are here in the Hyper-V Manager. We can go to switch management, and we see we have the compute switch already. And if it's a set switch, you can't configure the set switch with the Hyper-V Manager. So that's a good sign. We can't do anything here, so that we see here we have a set switch, and we can't find the cluster. Okay, not yet. We go back. So we are now done with the networking part, and we switch over to the clustering part of the cluster creation wizard. And there are 2 points. Validate, and we start the validation. No, we go back. We want the validate, checking a few things. It takes a moment. and we validate it again because I've done it before. I set it up a cluster here just to see if it works. It's always bad if you do a demo and you didn't have checked it. There can go so much wrong with a live demo anyway, if it worked or not. But if you go unprepared and haven't checked the stuff, that's very funny for the viewers if you are rambling about all what should work, but it doesn't. So we do the validation. The validation is saved in the in the local directory. So he recognized there is already a validation, so he offered us to skip it. And a word of advice: if you create a new cluster, always validate the cluster. And this is very nice, but let's talk a bit about the validation. Usually, if you do a validation in the failover clustering, you have to choose not all options for a storage spaces direct cluster. You have to choose, I want to choose what is validated, because the storage spaces direct validation part is not included in all options. And that, of course, is weird. So here in the cluster creation wizard, they have it done differently. We have validated it, but we can't see the validation because it's already there. So if we do a new validation, there should be a possibility to download it. I've done that before, so we can't see it here. But what would you see? You would see that the cluster has done 3 parts. It checks if the cluster is possible, but it will not check the storage spaces direct part here. Like it would not do that if you just go with the default options in the failover cluster. So we will come to that if we go to storage. So for him, so for the cluster creation wizard, for it, everything is fine. So we go to next, to the create cluster. And here we need, of course, a name. Da on cluster 2. I choose the same name I had before. And then under advanced, you have different options. So if you just go with this and don't go in the advanced part, the cluster computer object will choose a DHCP address, and this is recommended, and this is how Azure works. But I like my cluster to have a specific IP address, so I choose that here and I give it one. So then I have to click on add. So now we have an address here, and we can also specify which networks the cluster is allowed to use for the communication. I choose all of them, and I now go to create cluster, and that will take a moment to create the cluster. So Microsoft separated the cluster validation part in cluster, and I assume this is because we have different cluster creation scenarios. We could only create a cluster, or we could create a cluster with storage spaces direct, or we could create a compute cluster with SDN. So different cluster test scenarios. And so they split it up, the normal cluster tests and the storage cluster tests. We will do that a bit later. Hopefully, because I've already done them too. So I don't know if it offers us the storage validation. We can do it again, but I don't know if we can see it if we revalidate it like we had in the cluster part. So this takes a moment, yeah, creating the cluster. Time to go back to our nodes. We don't have the cluster here. And if we then have the cluster, after a minute, also the failover cluster. So now it's created, it's successfully. So when you're ready, we can skip the step and go to next. And now we are in the storage part. It's discovering the drives in the moment. It will show us the drives, but first let's go back to a node. And here we now see we have our cluster. When I click on the cluster, the failover cluster manager opens here, and I'm connected to the cluster. Of course, we don't have any storage, but we have our networks. Yeah, as it's usually done, we have our nodes. We don't have a witness, but we can take care of that later in the admin center. Go back to admin center here. So now verify drives. It checks all the drives and it find 9 drives that it could use for storage spaces direct. There is one SATA DOM drive in there and 8 NVMEs. And the cluster wizard is so clever that it will not take the SATA DOM drive into the cluster into the storage pool. Yeah, so we are fine here. I go to next. We have the same amount of drives and the same drive types in every node. And now, a nice thing, we are now able to clean the drives. And that's very important if the drives were ever used in another cluster that is not probably cleaned up. Some drives would have the information about the old storage space direct setup, the storage pool, and we would see a lot of drives here. So I click on clean, and there is a script. If you don't use that, there is a script. If we go here to Windows, to the IC, PowerShell IC, in the Microsoft documentation, there is a script. I destroy spaces. Look in the documentation. Usually you have to run this to clean up the drives. And I think it's much more convenient to just say clean drives here. So I go to next here. And now it validates the storage spaces direct part. So this is the cluster validation, now doing the storage spaces direct validation in the cluster validation. It will take a moment. That's complete already. That's nice. And here you see everything is golden. We can download the report here. That's missing on the cluster page. We can open it and we see that's a failover cluster validation report. All the parts that are tested with the storage spaces direct part. Everything is green. Fantastic. We go back here. Now we go to next. And now we can enable storage spaces direct. If we have caching, we can choose if we want to use caching devices, if we have different types of drives. We don't have that here. And if we have caching device, we can choose if it's an all-flash setup, so NVMEs and SSDs, for example, we can choose how the cache is used. Usually it's used as a write-only cache, but we can also switch to read-write. I wouldn't recommend that. I like the idea of a write cache in storage spaces direct when you have flash drivers, because flash drivers, usually the capacity drives, are fast enough for reads, but you can really use the double the size of the write cache. And so we are now enabling storage spaces direct, starting the health provider already. And I see I'm nearly done with my presentation. So let's finish the presentation and then come back to the demo. So where to find more information? My blog is hyper-v-server.de. I usually blog in German, but you can use a translator, of course, to read my contents. The Hyper-V Amigos you find under hyper-v-amigos.net. And if you want to see some recordings of CDC Germany 2019, where also Dave was presenter, and many other people like Didier, Jaromir, and so on, you can go here to cdc-germany.de/cdc-2019. So I already thank you for watching, and now we go back to our spaces. So it's done. We have another report to download. I will not do that. I go to finish. I go to the connection list, and here is our cluster. And now we have to do some things. For example, assign a witness. There is a possibility in Windows Admin Center now to also assign a witness. We go to settings here, and here's the witness part, and I copy a path here. So witness, we can choose between the witnesses. Be aware that the disk witness is not really supported. So, and I have to type again a user that has the rights to connect here, and I hope I didn't Did an arrow here. Yes, I did an arrow, unfortunately. But you can do other things here, configure live migration, configure a witness, go to storage pools, and so on. And you can create volumes here. You see the drives and everything. So thank you so much for watching my presentation. Thanks, Dave and Crystal, for giving me the opportunity. And back to Dave.